Hello and welcome back to One on One, New York's longest running sports call-in show. I'm James Birle. It is my privilege to welcome our next guest, who's something of a local legend, actually, from starting his career with the New York Yankees at the age of 6. That's right, 6 years old, to being inducted into the New York State Baseball Hall of Fame some 70 years later in 2022 for penning the book Baseball, the New York Game, How the National Pastime Paralleled U.S. History. Fordham University alumnus, Fordham history professor Tony Morante is here. Tony, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. How are you doing?
Oh, thank you so much, James. I'm doing fine. Being here always is a good feeling for me because I go back not only years, but we're talking about decades, So there's a familiarity that I have that just being in here gives me a good vibe.
Well, it's great to have you back. Obviously, you're native to the area here, the Belmont area, Little Italy, Arthur Avenue. So much of this place is paramount to you. So first, I want to go back. Tell me a little bit about being introduced to the Yankees organization at such a young age. What did that mean for you, and how has that brought you to where you are right now?
Okay, back in 1949, my dad was an usher.
Mm-hmm.
And the ushers at that time were allowed to take one or two of their sons, basically. I never saw any girls come by. And one or two of the sons were able to come in for free. So and I started coming in 49, and as what was happening was while the ushers were getting assigned, it was a seniority basis thing that they had to line up. So I was out in right field during batting practice collecting baseballs. I mean, a baseball, and sometimes I walk home with 2 or 3 baseballs. It was a wonderful thing. So I did that for about 10 years. Then my dad said, "Hey, pal, you're coming up on the arm long enough. You're going to have to start earning it." "What do you mean?" "Yeah, you're going to have to work if you want to come to the..." "I don't want to work." He says, "Well, you're going to have to if you want to come to the game. Here's an usher's mitt." And he flipped me an usher's mitt in 1958. And 58 happened to be a good year in that the Yankees went to the World Series. They beat the Braves in the World Series. And also, the greatest game ever in football history was played here on December 28th of 1958 with the Giants and the Colts in the sudden death overtime. I remember it like it was yesterday.
Wow.
I could tell you the lineup and everything. It's just, it had such an effect on me because my first year, and here I am, I'm getting crazy as a Giant fan, and unfortunately, Johnny Unitas had other things in mind.
Yeah.
So that was one of the greatest moments I've had as an usher. So I started my ushering at that point. I did that for about 15 years. In the interim, I joined the Navy. In 1962, I spent time in Guantanamo Bay. I was on various med cruises and aircraft carriers and destroyers, and I left there in 1966. Went down to work on Wall Street, and then eventually I got to the stadium in 1973 when Mr. Steinbrenner bought into the organization. So he changed things. He bought it from CBS. The period between 1964 was the last time the Yankees had been in the World Series until 1973. They had a nondescript team. They hit rock bottom in 67. They went down into the basement. All right. And CBS didn't, I think it was a situation where CBS didn't pay enough attention to what was going on the field. It was a business prospect. So eventually Mr. Steinberg bought into the organization with a consortium of 13 other guys for $10 million. And as a result, he started to turn things around. Now, that was the last year of the old stadium. So at the end of towards September, I would say, Gabe Paul, who was the president at the time, had said, we want to acknowledge our season ticket holders. We had about 6,000 season ticket holders at that time. And he said, let's give them something special. Why don't we give them a chair for the amount of seats that they had? So what we'll do, we'll have Envirex Demolition, the company that was tearing the stadium down for renovation, brought out 6,000 chairs, and they brought them across the street into the Yankee parking lot. And I was asked to do this deed, for the organization. They gave me a manifest of all the season ticket holders, so they would, and they announced it on the air at the end of September, September 30th, that we were going to do something special for our fans.
Awesome.
And if you have, just show some identification or a letter and present it here, and I would take care of it. So we only had about 4,000 people that came at that time. We had 2,000 left over. What was important here? 2,000 people, the 2,000 seats that were extras, I thought it'd be a good idea to sell them for like $10, $15 each. The price on them right now is off the charts, in thousands of dollars. They're collectibles, okay? And speaking of collectibles, that happened to be a big year for collectibles because there was so many other artifacts in the stadium, in the bowels of the stadium. They had Babe Ruth's underwear down there, and I mean, and you're meeting all these people and a lot of stars that were coming out and looking for a piece of the stadium, and that's when the collectibles really got going. And one of the owners, Barry Halper, was a big collector, so he even pushed it, and as a result of that, the industry started to really grow from that point. So we went to Shea Stadium for a couple of years and came back in '76. And then Mr. Steinbrenner had said when he bought the organization in '73, I'm going to get the Yankees back up to the top in 3 years. Well, he came close. he got us into '76. We got into the World Series for the first time since '64. So there's a 12-year gap. So unfortunately, we ran into the Big Red Machine. And they just crushed us. Yeah. It was a hard, but we're back now. Mr. Steinbrenner firmly believed in that free agency, which was just coming on the scene at that point. And the first big one that he signed was Catfish Hunter from Oakland, and Catfish was a great pitcher for Oakland.
Absolutely.
He helped them win 3 World Series in '72, '3, and '4. I think it said 2, 3, and 4. And then he comes to the Yankees, and he was one of the main starters. And other deals that they made, and eventually Reggie coming, and how Mr. Steinbrenner wooed Reggie, taking him on carriage rides down in Central Park and feeding him New York stuff. It was
no one else was doing that to sign players in baseball.
No. It was just at that time he knew the value, and when they had the special free agency draft, and this was the bellwether to the situation that had been in existence all through the years. So, if we go back to like 1880, when the free agency, not the free agency, when the owners had put a restriction on players jumping from team to team, the reserve clause came about. And that reserve clause lasted up until 1876, when the arbitrator, Peter Seitz, determined that the players were right, the owners were wrong. The players could go and bargain themselves on the free agent market. And this was a big thing.
Huge deal.
So now you got the free agents, and Mr. Steinbrenner jumped right in. And a lot of people, I'll never forget, they didn't like Mr. Steinbrenner buying all these things, but that was a sign of things to come. I mean, today, look
at it now.
You got numbers that you can't even imagine. But when the boss was doing it, he's buying his team. I said, you know what? You can't put the money in the batter's box. You can't put it on the pitcher's mound. You could buy whoever you want, but that doesn't guarantee anything.
Absolutely. Fortunately,
the Yankees won a couple of World Series, 77 and 78. And what a wonderful time that was. And that was, for me, being part of the World Series and everything, after being a fan going back 30 like that, it was something very special.
Yeah, absolutely. At the core of your book, Baseball, the New York Game, and your educational philosophy is the notion that American history and the development of baseball as a sport are inextricably linked. Can you talk to me a little bit about how that works and what you mean by that?
Well, what happens is we'll go back to the Revolutionary War period.
Mm.
General George Washington advocated leisure and exercise and games of ball
Hmm.
to forestall the boredom of his troops between battles.
Mm.
So this is first sign.
Yeah.
Folk games were happening. There were different kinds of games that were going on regarding ball, but it wasn't until the turn of the century when the market revolution came and the country shifted from an agrarian society to a more urban society. So urbanization became a big thing at that time. Now the games that were being played started to become a little more structured. All right, so the city was growing by leaps and bounds. It took over the number one slot from Philadelphia in that period, and it kept on moving. So from the Lower East Side, where the games originated, they kept on moving further and further up that east side because the developers were taking all of that good land
Mm-hmm.
and developing it for business purposes. And they chased these ball teams, specifically the Knickerbockers, up to Madison Square Park around
Mm.
4th Avenue and 26th Street at that time. And the Knickerbockers said, we're not going to go anywhere after this. We're going to jump to a more idyllic setting in Elysian Field in
Mm.
New Jersey. And that's where they played from 1845 to 1849. But there was an awful lot of things that were happening
Mhm.
at that time. Don't forget that the organized games, Philadelphia actually played an organized game, but they didn't play with any bylaws. That was 1831, but it wasn't until 1837 that the Gothams had organized rules. And the Knickerbockers eventually became an offshoot of the Gothams, and they were the ones that laid down the rules that are many of which are still in effect today. There were 20 of them, and that was the rules that the game was governed by. So the game has taken some really solid structure
Mm.
at this time, especially here in New York. But you also had Boston was vying for a top spot, so was Philadelphia, but it was the New York game that persisted. And why did it persist? As the New York Mercury came out with a statement in 1856 that the baseball is the national pastime.
Mm.
So that was a big period. And then moving forward, the game really started to take off. What happened was in 1845 with Manifest Destiny,
Mm-hmm.
President Polk insisted that the country move from the boundary, which was the Mississippi River, the western boundary of the Mississippi River at that time, to where they had trails going out to the western part of the country, but they weren't being used that much. But he was advocating that they started to get people to go to the West Coast. He wanted to see the people go from sea to shining sea.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the Knickerbockers went to seek their pot of gold, as gold was discovered in Potter's Mill
Mm-hmm.
in 1848 and in 1849. It was, you see so many San Francisco 49ers, and that's
Absolutely,
how that
right.
evolves. And they eventually started a team in 1851 called the San Francisco Knickerbockers. So that was basically the ground for the game to develop.
Mm-hmm. Specifically about New York, just bringing it back a little bit more locally, what makes New York's role in baseball history so special beyond the Manifest Destiny and Industrial Revolution?
Well, as I was mentioning, the game was evolving in New York,
Mm-hmm.
and it was the Knickerbockers that laid the rules down, and eventually the press determined that this was the national pastime. So this was very important that you had New York and being the center, because New York was becoming the center of all commerce and
Mhm.
theater and things of that nature. So there was a lot of attention drawn to the city at that time, and the teams that they had were, they were good teams.
Mm-hmm.
And the game just started to really develop until the amateur status was sort of dealt a blow in 1869 with the Cincinnati Red Stockings. But the New York game persisted, and here's where it really was important. During the Civil War,
Mm.
there were a lot of Northerners captive down in Southern prisons. And during their recreation time, they took the New York game
Mm.
and were playing the New York game. Now, the Southern captors looked at this and they started to play the game. When the Civil War was over and we're going into the Reconstruction era, the country needed unification.
Mm.
And baseball,
Played a big role.
absolutely. Absolutely.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So in 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad was built and the Cincinnati Red Stockings went on a spree cross country and they won 69 games without a loss. And 2 years later, that was the national, not the National League, the National Association of Professional Baseball Players, which eventually became the National League in 1876 here in New York. So a lot of the meetings and things were held here in New York, and New York was like the epicenter of all of that was going on at that time. And don't forget, we're in the industrialization period where you had all these, the big industrialists like the robber barons, the Cornelius Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, and those guys who they were titans in their industry. But the owners of the baseball teams sort of followed suit there. And they became more or less titans. And that's why in 1880, after there was a lot of what they call revolving going on at the time, where a player would leave one team at the expense of going to another team without any notification or any contract that he had with his original team. And that wasn't a good thing. So the owners designed this reserve clause, which went into effect about 1880 until it was defeated in court in 1976.
It's incredible how many decades back this goes. I want to again ask about New York. You call our little neighborhood here in the Bronx home. You've never really left it. You've been here just about for as long as you can remember. What are you most proud of about being from this part of New York?
What I'm most proud of this little area that we have here, the Bronx Zoo, Fordham, and the New York Botanical Garden.
It's beautiful.
So the progression was when there was geographical situations where people would head up and leave. The neighborhoods were going into they were being. There was a big change. So what happened was some of the families left the Bronx, and they traveled to Yonkers, then from Yonkers to Mohegan Lake, and Mohegan Lake, Mahopac, and Carmel, and further north. But when my family kept on asking me, well, when are you coming up here? I met my wife in the Botanical Garden, okay, in 93. I had a 20-year run with her. She passed away a few years ago. And my heart and soul is here. I live off Pelham Parkway. I just enjoy going back to the old neighborhood, Arthur Avenue. I know the folks there, and a lot of book signings and things like that. But this is near and dear to me, especially Fordham. And I had the opportunity back in the 60s. This was an Irish bastion. Let's get this clear, okay? And I didn't think that I would make it here at Fordham. And so I didn't even try at that point. But when I got out of the Navy and I had the GI Bill, I said, you know what? I was working on Wall Street at the time, and we went into a depression, and I wasn't happy. And so I said, let me give Fordham a shot. And I got accepted. And I graduated in 79. And Fordham had been a part of it. I was on the board, the Fordham Alumni Board there during the 80s. And so Fordham never really left me. It's part of my DNA.
I absolutely love that. And that's why we wanted to come and speak to you, someone whose heart and soul is in this area. That's the people we want to hear from. Going back to some more of the baseball of it all, you've been in New York for some of the most iconic moments in baseball history. Talked about the 70s Yankees. I mean, the late 50s, early 60s Yankees are up there in terms of the all-time greats in baseball history. Do you have any personal memory of the Yankees or any New York baseball moment that you lived through that you have a favorite one?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah?
Mickey Mantle was my idol.
Yeah.
All right. So he came aboard in 51.
Mm-hmm.
The Yankees were hot at that time. Now, a little sidebar here. My mom came from Brooklyn.
Okay.
All right. My dad came from the Bronx.
Mm.
Never the twain shall meet. Okay. So what happened was during holidays, we would sometimes go out to Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as I walked through the door of my aunt and uncle's house, I would get, the Yankees stink. What do you mean? Yeah, the Yankees stink. Oh, Uncle Tom, how can you say that? So I was a youngster at that time, but by 1953, I was 11 years old.
Mm-hmm.
We had won 5 in a row, 5 World Series in a row. We beat the Dodgers 3 times. So when he hit me with that, I said, what do you mean we stink? We won 5 in a row. We beat Brooklyn 3 times. So there was always a thing going on. Brooklyn had a culture unto itself. Make no mistake about it. The ballpark, the bandbox that it was in, Hilda Chester and the cowbell, Shorty Lawrence and the Dodger Symphony, Happy Felton's Knot Hole Gang. This was all of a culture of the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Mm-hmm.
And the players used to live in the area, so there was
That's
an
awesome.
affinity, so unfortunately, O'Malley couldn't make it work with Bob Abrams, who was the main developer at that time. And then when they built the Cross Bronx Expressway, it chopped up a lot of neighborhoods. So there was a lot of things that went wrong. But my favorite moment, getting back to your question, I think one of that was when I was an usher. I became an usher in 58. In 1960, Mickey Mantle's popularity had grown so much so at that time that the fans were allowed to leave the ballpark by way of the field. All right. Some of them didn't go out. So if you figure home plate is the southern corner, okay. Now you're going to go all the way to center field where you get to River Avenue, where you get the trains, the L. They didn't just go out that way. They went out to get Mickey Mantle. Okay, so it got so bad with Mickey that one time he got popped.
Oh.
Yeah, he must have said something. I mean, the people, they wanted a piece of him. They wanted his hat, his glove. They were grabbing his belt and all that. And he asked for security. So they didn't have a security detail per se at that time. So it had to be some of the ushers. So the head usher assigned what they called a suicide squad of 6 guys, and particularly young, fast guys. Once the game was over, and the games usually were over after the top of the ninth, the Yankees were winning.
Yeah.
So the game was over, people were jumping over the fence. So we had to go out. When I was chosen, we had to go out and meet Mickey by second base and escort him in. This was like the biggest thrill that I had.
Yeah.
You know, these are the things that hey Mickey, follow me. You know, it was crazy stuff. But that's probably one of my favorite memories.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
That's so incredible. And were you often one of the ushers asked to help out
Yes,
Mickey?
yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And it was called the Suicide Squad.
The Suicide Squad. That's a terrific name too.
Yeah.
That's so much fun. Let's take a look at the modern game a little bit, if you'll humor me here. Baseball has been going through a bit of a transformation, I would say, with the pitch clock and the extra innings rules, runners on second base, all this, that they're trying to evolve the baseball to the modern American sports landscape. So what can we learn from looking back into the past, from stories in baseball, the New York game, about preserving and redeveloping our national pastime? Do you think that there's anything to be concerned about?
No, but first of all, the game's resilient. Okay, so it's going to experience growth patterns which some people aren't in favor of. Maybe they don't want to hear about a pitch clock. Maybe they don't want to hear about this ghost runner on second base and things of that nature. But this is what has to happen to the game to evolve into a better situation. I believe that football and basketball have taken over the popularity top rungs.
Maybe.
Okay?
Yeah.
But baseball is more globalized. All right? And that's one of the big things that baseball has going for it. And as it's a professional game in some of the European countries, Japan, it's the national pastime.
Yeah.
And how that evolved back in 1882, it was Professor an English professor from the United States who went over to Japan to teach English, brought the game of baseball. Okay,
And look
so
at it now.
that became their national pastime also. And then I had the chance to get hooked up with Hideki Matsui, who was a great Japanese ball player. So
Absolutely.
a lot of the Japanese people would come out on my tours. Some of them would say, "I know you. Could you give me your autograph?" I said, "Well, where do you know me from?" "You on television. You
With
big
Hideki
star." And
Matsui.
everything. Oh my God! So, so here to get to your answer. So the game is constantly evolving, and I think one of the biggest changes in the game right now are the analytics.
Oh, absolutely.
And one of our guys, as a matter of fact, a Fordham grad, Nick Setti, was the head of the analytics squad here. He was in the Gabelli, and I got to know Nick. He happened to live around the corner from me, and he's married now, doing well. But the analytics is a big part of the game. Some of these managers have to listen to the guys from MIT, and and take into account the propensities of who swings at what and what pitches you work against.
There's so much.
There's so much to dive into. It's a different game. It's a different game, but it's still basically baseball. And you got the diamond, and a big change came about in the '70s with the free agency, and people were ticked off that these guys are making all this money. I said, yeah, but they're not going into the owners' pockets. The owners are pulling it out. And I said, well, why would it bother you? Just keep in mind that the game is played between the lines. If you start thinking about all this superfluous stuff, you're going to get in trouble. Okay, so that's where the game is. And as I said, it's resilient as far as how it's changed. Sure, Babe Ruth changed the game big time.
Yeah.
All right. So 1919, you had the Black Sox scandal, you had women's suffrage, you had the flu epidemic.
Yes.
Okay, had World War I had just come to an end. The game was, and you had the dead ball era.
Yeah.
Don't forget that they used one baseball. Whether it went into the stands
They
or
would throw
not,
it back.
they had to throw it back.
Yeah.
When baseball came, when Babe Ruth came, I should say, in 1920, they changed the baseball rules. They insisted on clean baseballs. So Babe, who had the home run record, which he set the year before with 29, now he comes to New York with a clean baseball, a new uniform and everything, and he hits 54 home runs,
Incredible.
which was more than any other team had hit at that time. So you can imagine
insane.
the impact that he made on the game. And on through the years, and then the integration part of it was really big in '47. And so the game just kept on growing, and now it's growing more globally. So I think what you had asked me is where it stands today. I think it's in a good position. They've taken it, as a matter of fact, they had some games over in England last week, and they're going to be playing more professional games there. And as we mentioned, Japan is really big. So China's picking it up now. And if they get a hold of it, like...
Who knows, right?
Yeah, so it's got a lot of promise.
I think so, too. So we're running out of time. I got one more question for you, and we're going to stick with modern a little bit. The Yankees have a league's best 50-24 record at the moment. The Mets, not as good, but they're on a great run right now. They haven't lost in about a week ever since Grimace threw out the first pitch. So I want to ask you, how great is it to be a New York baseball fan today? And do you think the Yankees can break that 15-year World Series drought in 2024?
I think they have the possibility is great. It depends on who stays on the field. We lost a big guy yesterday, Anthony Rizzo. The other team in the National League is doing very well. They're on a little streak right now, but you don't know how long these streaks are going to last.
Yeah.
It's right now we're sitting on top of the game. We had a couple of bad games over the weekend. I don't know if anything more than injuries are going to deter the Yankees from playing in postseason. And then right now, the Mets have a shot. They have a shot. They're playing good baseball. They won 8 out of 10 or something like that. and all of a sudden they turned things around. But people were writing them off.
Yeah.
If you listen to some of the radio stations, they were dead and buried.
Yeah, I mean, we were one of them. We were one of those radio
Is
stations.
that right?
Yeah. I mean, there wasn't a lot of great things to talk about the Mets, but you do think the Yankees have a real shot at the World Series?
Absolutely. I mean, you take a look at the lineup and the pitching
Pitching as well,
staff is there's really not a weak spot per
Mhm.
se. They can do it.
Mhm.
Let's put it that way.
They
They
can
can
do
do it. You have Baltimore right on our heels. Okay. You have Philadelphia doing what they're doing
Yeah.
out there in the National League.
The Dodgers.
The Dodgers,
Mm.
yeah.
It could be a
So,
giant. Yeah.
This could be very interesting going down into September and maybe October.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this stroll down baseball memory lane and for talking a little bit of modern baseball. That's all the time we have, unfortunately. I would like to extend a big thank you to Tony Morante for joining us. An excellent discussion. You can find Baseball, the New York Game, how the national pastime paralleled U.S. history, online and in stores now. Tony, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invite, and I enjoyed spending the time with you.